Elaine Howard Ecklund spent 13 years as a student at Cornell University, earning bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees there, with time out as a visiting graduate student fellow at Princeton. After finishing her PhD in 2004, she spent a couple of years as a postdoctoral fellow at Rice University, then took a job as a sociology professor for 2 years at SUNY Buffalo. Apparently, the snow in Buffalo got to her because she quickly returned to Rice down in Texas and remains there to this day as a very active sociologist of religion with a high international profile in the field. Jerry Park majored in psychology at the University of Virginia, but went on to complete a sociology PhD at Notre Dame in 2004, the same year that Ecklund got her degree. His Korean background got him interested particularly in religiosity among Asian Americans. After graduation, he joined the sociology department at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, just up the freeway from Ecklund in Houston. Shortly after they got settled in their respective universities, they collaborated on this article that reflects Park's special interest in Asian Americans as well as their shared expertise in the sociology of religion.
Park and Ecklund knew that plenty of previous research had shown how strongly parents can influence the religious beliefs and identities of their children. But as they complain in the opening pages of their article, most of that research had been amazingly ethnocentric. Sociologists are notorious for their rather parochial tunnel vision with a focus almost entirely on present-day social patterns in the United States. Since most people in the United States in the late 20th century express at least nominal Christian identities, the sociology of religion has tended to limit itself to this mainstream domestic religious culture. That research has established that parental families form the crucible within which the foundation of religious identity is formed for children. But Park and Ecklund point out that even within this limited focus on contemporary American society, the faces in the crowd of the American population are changing. In particular, they cite numerous studies showing the impact of a great wave of immigration into the country that began in the 1960s and 1970s and that has continued down to the present day, almost half a century later. They show, for example, that 1 of every 5 children and adolescents in the United States today are either foreign-born or have at least one immigrant parent. Other research has shown that immigrant families experience particular challenges communicating between generations when parents are the products of one cultural framework in their countries of origin, but their U.S.-born children are growing up in another cultural framework, that of domestic and American society. Since immigrant families face these special challenges, they suggest that such problems of intergenerational communication might well have a disruptive effect on the ability of parents to transmit their own religious heritage to their children. The strong influence of parents found in previous research may not apply with equal force to the very large fraction of young new Americans growing up in the early 21st century. With this question in mind, they look around for evidence that could provide answers. Like nearly all research on religion in American society, this study has to rely on information collected by the investigators themselves. In this case, Park and Ecklund did things the hard way, conducting their own personal interviews with Asian young adults. All of the 88 students included in their study either immigrated into the United States before age 13, the so-called 1.5 generation, or were born in the U.S. but had at least one parent born outside the country, making them second-generation children of immigrants. Park and Ecklund did not actually sit down with these students in person to conduct the interviews. These were completed over the phone or through email exchanges. All of the respondents were enrolled at one of 4 universities in different parts of the country: the University of Houston, the University of Chicago, the University of California at Irvine, and the State University of New York at Stony Brook. How did Park find these students in order to ask his 20 questions? To form his sample, he contacted student organizations at each university and introduced his research topic to the student leaders of these groups, asking for people who fit the description of either second-generation children of immigrants or of the 1.5 generation who arrived as children but grew up after puberty in the United States. This follows the general rule of thumb that we think of ourselves as coming from the place where we went through puberty. Park did not interview all the people who responded to his requests made to the various ethnic student groups at the 4 universities. He wanted a balanced sample with quotas of respondents from different backgrounds. For example, half his respondents were male and half were female. They ranged in age from 18 through 26, normal ages for college enrollment, and their Asian ancestry spanned a range of countries that included India, China, Korea, Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan, and a few other places. This gender and ethnic balance allows Park and Ecklund to compare men and women and to compare people from different origin countries to see whether such features of their backgrounds make any difference in the results of the study. The quota sampling used to choose respondents for these interviews also extended to different religious backgrounds. A little over half of the students in the sample reported coming from Christian families, reflecting a higher than average motivation for Christians in these origin countries to move to the United States, and also reflecting a tendency for some immigrants from these Asian countries to convert to Christianity after arriving in the United States. Protestants slightly outnumbered Catholics in this half of the sample, a division that also correlates with country of origin. For example, most Christians from Vietnam would likely be Catholic, reflecting the country's French colonial past, while most Christians from Korea probably belong to the Korean Presbyterian Church, which historically had a very strong mission presence in that country. Similarly, most of the Hindu respondents' families undoubtedly originated from India, since Hinduism is largely a religion of the Indian subcontinent inherited from one's ancestors. So this measure of religion is highly correlated with national origins, to the extent that in many cases they can be regarded as proxies for each other. For some reason, Park and Ecklund did not choose to analyze the religious identities of students who reported none of the above when asked to choose a religion, even though there were as many of these respondents as of Hindus, tying for third place after the Protestants and Catholics groups. It could well be that this none of the above group would have described their parental families and other background circumstances that might have included involvement of other family members with organized churches. The authors seem to have left out any cases that might argue against the ability of families to pass on religious traditions to their children. For example, what if these none of the above people came disproportionately from families where their parents identified with different religions? We will never know because these 15 cases are not reviewed in the article or compared to the other students being studied. Park and Ecklund pay more attention to some of the other limitations of their study design. In particular, they're careful to point out that this group of 88 young Asian respondents should not be taken for a representative sample of all young second-generation Asians in the United States. They were almost all leaders in ethnic student organizations at top universities, a very special selection out of that larger population. For example, these interviews tell us nothing at all about how parents might influence the religiosity of their children in the case of young Asians who have dropped out of high school and joined street gangs in some American cities. As with all small selective samples chosen for intensive interviews, this kind of first-person research can explore a much richer level of detail and subjective attitudes than we could get from a larger, more impersonal survey research questionnaire or from administrative records of some sort, if such records existed about religion in America, which they do not. But this richer detail comes at the expense of great difficulty in generalizing from these 88 respondents to anybody else in the population. With these limitations in mind, let's consider what Park and Ecklund discovered in the interviews conducted with these students. The heart of what Park and Ecklund learned from their interviews with second-generation Asian American students confirmed a lot of what they already knew from previous research with more general samples of the U.S. population. In particular, they had started with the important question of whether the immigration experience created a more difficult generational gap between foreign-born parents and children growing up in the midst of American society. Such a generation gap, widened by the contrast between origin and destination cultures, could plausibly reduce the ability of parents to transmit a religious heritage to their children. If that religious heritage is not part of the surrounding American cultural setting, it could be harder for children to appreciate, understand, or accept it. This was a sound research question to ask. But such a possible weakening of parental influence never appears among these Asian American students. The results of Park's 88 interviews show that if anything, the bonds between these students and their immigrant parents are unusually strong. Students reported good rapport with their parents and often mentioned that parents influenced their own thoughts and feelings about religion, both within the setting of their family homes and by actively channeling them into church activities. So at first glance, it would seem that the original research concern about parental influence weakened by immigration and the split between origin and destination cultures turns out to be nothing to worry about. But of course, as with any small-scale, highly selective field study like this, we have to keep in mind precisely who we're talking about. First of all, these are all high-achieving university students, not only succeeding at prominent universities, but also active in ethnic student associations. This practically guarantees that the research design carefully selected respondents who have particularly strong ties both to their parental families, which are crucial sources of support and encouragement needed for success in university studies, and to their ethnic cultural heritage as demonstrated by participation in these student associations. After all, religion goes along with language and other features of cultural background as one of the defining dimensions of what it means to be ethnic. So it should be no surprise that many students involved in ethnic student associations also have adopted salient religious identities for themselves. If there are any young second-generation Asian Americans out there who do experience a widened generation gap with their immigrant parents, they probably will not show up in a sample selected from successful university students who belong to ethnic student associations. To reinforce this selectivity of the studied sample, Park and Ecklund also choose in this article only to discuss the interviews they had with students who did express some kind of religious identity. It would have been very interesting to hear some of the interview comments from the none of the above students to see whether they had different experiences with their parents. Among these studied cases of successful religious transmission, Park and Ecklund find another clear parallel with patterns already established in previous, more general studies. They find that for the most part, students reported a stronger influence of mothers than of fathers for several aspects of their own religious experience. Mothers were more likely than fathers to be the prime movers insisting on regular church attendance. Mothers also were more active themselves as members of such congregations. Mothers talked more about religious values and beliefs in the home. All of these patterns confirm similarities in religious socialization between these Asian American children of immigrants and other young adults in American society. But the evidence from these interviews also reveals two ways that these Asian American children of immigrants differed from what other research found in other settings. For these students, other family members often emerged in the interviews as strong influences on their own religious identities. For example, several quotes in the article show how brothers and sisters, particularly older brothers and sisters, often played a crucial role in getting a student to think more deeply about religious questions. Sometimes this influence led a student to appreciate more the religious heritage of the culture from which their family had come. And sometimes a sibling instead paved the way for a student to explore the idea of converting to Christianity if that was not the original religious background of their family. It is also interesting that while Park and Ecklund did find some cases of students converting to Christianity in the United States, they did not find a single case of students brought up in Christian families who converted instead to an immigrant religion like Hinduism or Buddhism. All the students who identified as Hindu or Buddhist came from families that had given them that identity as an inheritance. These second-generation Asian American children of immigrants reported important religious influences not only from their brothers and sisters, but also from extended family members such as grandparents, uncles and aunts, cousins, and the like. In some cases, this reflects the immigrant experience of families extending patterns of co-residence lineally to include multiple generations, and laterally to include relatives outside the immediate nuclear family. Such temporary household extension has been a feature of immigrant life for many generations in American society, visible among immigrants from European countries 100 years ago, just as it continues to appear among immigrants from Latin America and Asia in the present. If your grandmother or grandfather lives in your house the entire time that you're growing up, of course that person can be a strong influence on your own religious identity. But such influence of other relatives was not limited only to co-residents. Students even reported that if they traveled back to the country of their parents' birth, other relatives there, including sometimes quite remote relatives, could actually have an influence on their own religious identities. So with respect to their original research question, Park and Ecklund have confirmed much of what we already knew from American society in general, and show that it also applies to these second-generation children of immigrants. Families appear among these students as the fundamental source of religious identity. They also confirm the general conclusion that mothers play a larger role than fathers in this transmission of religion from one generation to the next, both through interactions within the home and by channeling children into organized religious settings and activities. But their research has revealed some special features of immigrant families with respect to religion. Apparently, family connections of all kinds can become valuable resources for coping with the challenges of moving around the world and adapting to new host societies. Apparently, family connections grow stronger for some immigrant families rather than being weakened as they feared when they started their study. As you think about these findings, though, keep in mind just who was included as respondents in this study and who was not. We have seen that this research based on second-generation Asian American students in U.S. universities documents that the immediate family context continues to play a central role in religious socialization. These findings fit in with other research showing the importance of parents for transmitting religion across generations, and also add evidence of the special importance of brothers, sisters, and other relatives as influences on religious identity. In addition to this central focus on families as contexts for religious socialization, however, Park and Ecklund also address a different topic featured in research on immigrants ever since the waves of European immigrants were pouring into the United States 100 years ago. Earlier studies of Germans, Italians, Greeks, Russians, Scandinavians, and Polish immigrants in America often singled out ethnic church congregations as very important organizations, not only for reinforcing a particular religious identity, but for sustaining a broader social construct, the idea of ethnic identity considered more broadly. Particularly around the middle of the 20th century, many books and articles were written to document how ethnic churches appeared to thrive in all immigrant communities. Although they do not say as much about this topic as about the importance of families, Park and Ecklund also gathered information about this aspect of life for their second-generation Asian American student respondents. It is easy to see why researchers who study immigrant populations would be interested in religious congregations as social settings. After all, the whole concept of ethnicity and ethnic identity revolves around social institutions and the group identities that they can create. Ethnicity is commonly defined in terms of shared group history, particularly national origins, shared language, and importantly for us here, shared religion. These are the building blocks of what we call ethnicity. They explain why ethnic churches might become so salient in the lives of immigrant populations from Asia or from anywhere else. An ethnic congregation creates a social space where both religion and national origins, key elements of ethnic identity, come together. An ethnic church can provide a safe zone, an enclave where people can hold on to a shared heritage and anchor that heritage in the powerful context of religious beliefs. Members of such an ethnic congregation can turn to each other for moral and religious support, and also for support in many other ways. Another important topic that emerged from study of ethnic churches among earlier generations of American immigrants focuses on these other kinds of support that a congregation can provide. Particularly in the rough and tumble environment of American cities 100 years ago, immigrants from various parts of Europe often found themselves in pretty challenging situations. Not only adults, but children of immigrants often worked long hours in factories or struggled to find a living on the streets. Housing could be hard to come by. Families often were scattered or broken by these powerful forces. Into this challenging environment stepped what came to be called the institutional church, a sort of full-service social welfare institution that not only provided a place for religious worship, but offered all kinds of other support, such as dormitories for housing, schools for children, medical clinics, counseling services, food banks, and other services that ministered to the bodies as well as the souls of the people who came through the doors. The YMCA and the YWCA both were born out of this institutional church movement, for example. Ethnic congregations can continue to play this supportive role for contemporary generations of immigrants into the United States from Asia and other countries, still rooted in religion, but still providing a whole spectrum of kinds of support. Park and Ecklund do find some evidence of the importance of ethnic congregations as modern-day incarnations of the institutional church, but they do not spend a lot of time talking about this aspect of their respondents' lives, even though they raised the issue at the beginning of their article. It would be interesting to know whether they have more material from their interviews that would address how much their respondents have been involved in such activities, either as providers or as receivers of institutional church supports in their lives. It would be interesting, in fact, to go out and do some additional research on this question in immigrant communities in America today. But the main point emphasized by Park and Ecklund in the evidence that they present to us, and in the conclusions that they provide at the end of their article, concerns the central role of the immediate family context for transmitting religious identity to these second-generation Asian university students. Their identities with respect to religion seem, according to their own testimony, to be based mainly on their interactions with their mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters, and other family members, and on the examples set by these relatives both within the home and in channeling them into organized congregational settings. The potential for immigration to create a gap between generations, a gap that might interfere with inheritance of religious identities, does not show up as an actual problem in this sample of respondents. If anything, their families have been stronger and more influential than ever. This might be because they represent a highly selected, successful group of young adults, of course. We would need research on other groups of second-generation Asian Americans to test that possibility. But these close family bonds also could be due to the immigrant experience itself or to the special features of Asian cultures in which Confucian principles of generational hierarchy and solidarity always have been particularly strong. This raises a final important question, which Park and Ecklund do not consider, but which will become much more important in the future. What will happen in later generations when these second-generation students eventually have children and even grandchildren of their own? These future generations will be U.S.-born children of U.S.-born parents. The special issues of immigrant generations will fade into their family histories. Will the ethnic congregations of Korean Presbyterians and Vietnamese Catholics persist into the future as ethnic enclaves with extended programs of language training and various institutional support programs? Will families remain influential as transmitters of religious identity in those future generations? Will those identities remain sharp and clear, or will these future generations begin to dissolve into the wider context of changing religious identities in American life? Only time will tell. Maybe your own research someday in the future will give us answers to such questions.